Hello, everybody. Welcome to Quilty Conscience, the only podcast that's kind of about quilting. I'm your host, Kate, and today we'll be staying on topic and getting a history lesson.
And I'm your host, Guy from down the street. I'm excited to learn more about the history of quilting in the United States from you.
Yeah, we've got several different topics to talk about today, and we're going to try to keep things pretty much in chronological order as we go. So quilting, as we know it, originated in Europe with the production of padded garments like doublets for underneath armor during the Crusades. Eventually, these techniques were used for making blankets as well, and we even have some surviving quilts from the 14th century. Quilting has always been something that's both practical and decorative, but mostly the middle and upper classes have been quilting. The lower classes just kind of made do with whatever they had, but quilting was a little too high effort for them. But by the time the American colonies were made, most colonists in America were quilting, and they were doing it as a decorative art. So they were importing a lot of fine fabrics from India and China, as well as England, in order to supply them with all of the decorative fabrics they needed. And eventually, as we know, the transatlantic slave trade led to two major things worth addressing in the history of American quilting. So for starters, cotton production in the South became probably the South's biggest industry or biggest agriculture product, and that was fueled entirely by slavery. Cotton and quilting have a very long history with one another. Many quilting fabrics and quilt batting are still made out of cotton, and it's something that's worth thinking about when you're studying early American quilts, just thinking about what kind of labor went into the production of those things. The other significant element of slavery in quilting that should be noted is the production of quilts by enslaved women. Generally, these women learned from their mistresses how to quilt, and it became a necessity. They used leftover fabric from quilts made for their master's family to make quilts for themselves. Considering the bedding that was usually provided to them as slaves was not adequate to keep them warm. But quilting soon became a communal activity. Women could gather around and work on a single quilt together. They would pass these skills on to the next generation, and it became a form of artistic expression and memory for enslaved people. They could incorporate elements of African design and tradition that they kept with them throughout being enslaved. Now, related to this, I also wanted to talk about quilting and abolition. So abolitionists in America were primarily women, as historically women are often the first to engage with major social justice movements. Abolitionists used quilting to support their movement. Often they would make quilts with abolitionist sayings, slogans, and symbols on them, and these quilts would be sold at fairs. These fairs were organized to spread awareness for abolition, and selling handcrafted items was one way to get more attendance in for these fairs. And I do want to correct a historical myth that I actually was originally going to include in this, and then I found out that it is not true, but it is a common belief. So I've heard that quilts sometimes were made by abolitionists that featured maps or secret directions and symbols on how to get to safe houses as part of the Underground Railroad. That is not true. There is no historical evidence of this. There's only one source that claims it, and it was written over 100 years after Civil War, so it's probably not very accurate.
Yeah, kind of weird that one single person said this and everyone was like,
yes. Was like, yes, that's for real. Absolutely. So I do want people to understand that the legacy of slavery in quilting is not over. These communities still exist, and they still create works from what they've learned over generations. The Gee's Bend Quilt Collective is a group of women in the very small community of Gee's Bend, Alabama. They're dislaved from enslaved people on a cotton plantation, and many of those formerly enslaved people eventually became sharecroppers on the land after the abolition of slavery. As with other enslaved people that I've previously discussed, they began using fabric scraps and old clothing to make their quilts, and they still use this. There's a lot made with denim and random fabrics. So this reuse and recycling of textiles is still key to the quilts that they make now. These women have been making these quilts for generations, and the culture that they've built on their art is really deep and meaningful to them. And their quilts are really some of the most recognizable ones that I've ever seen. They have kind of a minimalist quality. They're a little geometric. They've got a lot of lines, and they take inspiration from African textiles as well as some Native American textiles. Now, in the 20th century, their quilts began to be recognized as fine art and something worth exhibiting in museums. And a man named William Arnett, a curator, began collecting these quilts and exhibiting them himself. And there ended up actually being a lawsuit that he was not fairly compensating these women for their work and not paying enough for the quilts. But that's a side topic. So the fabric choices and composition is really unique. As I said, it's a lot of reused things. The color schemes are not really conventionally what you'd think of in quilts. And they're all kind of improvised, and they work on them as they go. There's no set plan. There's no pattern. There's no like rulers or anything. They're just kind of going off what they feel like, and they end up with these really beautiful quilts.
So you mentioned that it was only in the 20th century that they began to look at these quilts from Gee's Bend as fine art. Why do you think the perception of the quilts has changed over time? Maybe cultural significance, artistry, changing racial relations, or other things?
I think for one thing, Gee's Bend was a very isolated community, and their work was really not very well known at all until a white curator came in and decided to buy the quilts and exhibit them as a piece of Southern culture and heritage. They did not really leave the community. They didn't talk to people outside of Gee's Bend. So most people didn't even know about their quilts.
Okay.
And I think it really took the recognition of an establishment and of seeing these quilts hung up on white gallery walls for people to really notice, like, oh, there's something in this. There's something really special about these. Now, there are some other examples of quilting being exhibited as fine art, though our next example is a little more of a conventional approach to fine art. So Faith Ringgold is a contemporary artist whose most well-known works are her story quilts. Ringgold's story quilts are based on her childhood experiences and the common experiences of African Americans in the United States, but Ringgold introduces some amount of fantasy and playfulness into these story quilts. Ringgold's work, with its emphasis on storytelling and community, recalls the communal experience of working on quilts and sharing these stories that were only known orally. One of the topics she has specifically addressed is the lack of representation of Black people in highly regarded fine arts like the European masters. And in a series of story quilts called The French Collection, Ringgold tells the story of Willia Marie Simone, a young Black woman who leaves Harlem to go to Paris and work as a model and artist.
Do you think the story quilts in some way help preserve those oral traditions and stories that you were talking about?
So Ringgold's story quilts are all original narratives with these original characters that she's named and have these whole lives that she kind of illustrates. And historically, story quilts really aren't that common. And just quilts with texts and words weren't really super common, besides maybe what we talked about with abolitionism. However, I do think Ringgold's quilts kind of keep the practice of quilting alive. And as a result, quilting keeps oral traditions alive as well. So I think there is kind of some tradition and some history that gets carried on.
Okay, yeah.
So the 12 quilts in this series, the French Collection, include artists like Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, patrons of Ringgold, and famed Black women from history like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Most of these people, of course, were not alive at the same time, and they certainly were not all living in Paris. But the fantasy and the fiction of it is part of the point. It's imaginative, it's eye-catching, it's humorous, and it's something that's engaging to anyone from any audience. And I think the fact that Ringgold expresses these stories through quilting imbues these stories with a lot of warmth and the community that quilts hold, and they remind the audience that these stories are not just these vaulted, untouchable oil paintings, but narratives that come from the heart of a real person.
It seems like throughout all of this, a main feature that you've kind of brought up over and over again is community when quilting, and how that has passed on culture and the art of quilting. And I think that that's really awesome and interesting. Just as a side note, it seems to come up a lot. And I think that's
definitely.
Really cool.
It's a major aspect is, how much these are rooted in the community.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think quilting seemed to always be at the forefront of social movements? Because you mentioned abolition and slavery and other things. Maybe did it symbolize something greater during these times?
So I think when we're talking about an example like abolition, quilting is a lot more accessible than art forms like painting. A lot of women probably already had some sewing skills, they owned a machine, and even if they didn't, it doesn't take very long to learn how to quilt relative to some other artistic skills. And so it was something that I think a large population of women could get involved with quickly, and they could, help each other with these skills a lot more easily than something like painting. Our most current topic to discuss takes us back to what we talked about with Faith Ringgold, and it's about an artist who's currently working with quilting and is taking it to a level that I think is just incredible. Bisa Butler. Bisa Butler makes life-size portrait quilts of different Black figures. Some of these are celebrities, some of them are authors, artists, and others are based on old photographs, including photos by Gordon Parks. Unlike Ringgold's quilts, which do use acrylic paint as well as fabric, Butler's pieces are entirely quilted. There is no paint, it's all fabric. So the depth and the dimension of the colors in her works come just from layering these pieces. And she likes to avoid using like just representational colors. So she doesn't use traditional flesh tones. She uses these really vibrant blues and reds and greens all next to each other, all contrasting, but it adds this incredible depth to the pieces and just gives them so much life, I feel like, to look at. And I think just the amount of detail she gets to and how specific she is with these pieces, that there's no paint, it's all quilted, is just remarkable when you look at her work. It's like, and the fact that these are all life-sized, I mean, it's incredible.
That's a lot of work, and it takes tremendous skill to do something like that.
Yeah, and for her, it came from turning to quilting, came from the fact that it was something she could do at home, that it was something that was accessible.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of something that we can come out with as an end point about all of this, is that quilting is very much rooted in community. It's rooted in accessibility. It's rooted in being a skill that is not too hard, but something that is really beautiful and very joyful to learn.
And can hold a lot of meaning.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well,
thank you all. Thank you all for listening to this first episode of Quilty Conscience. We hope you will be back for the next episode.
Yeah, whenever that may be, and we'll see you later.
Yeah, bye.